To the world, she was the girl next door, the golden voice and the bright smile that defined an era of innocence. We thought we knew Doris Day. We saw the sunshine, the songs, and the sparkling eyes. But behind the white picket fence of her public image, Doris was fighting a battle that remained hidden for decades. While she sang about a bright tomorrow, her reality was often a nightmare of control and deception. Beneath the surface of Hollywood's most wholesome star lay a secret that would change everything we thought we knew about her. What happens when the person who makes the whole world feel safe doesn't feel safe in her own home? Doris Mary and Vaughn Kappelhoff did not grow up with the burning ambition typically found in Hollywood legends. Born in Cincinnati, Ohio, her early years were defined by a simple, rhythmic joy, dancing. Alongside her partner, Jerry Doherty, she was part of a duo that seemed destined for the grandest stages of New York. Doris possessed a natural, fluid grace that suggested her path was already paved. However, fate has a way of redirecting even the most promising lives. At just 15 years old, a devastating car accident shattered her right leg, and with it, her dreams of professional dance. The psychological impact of this loss cannot be overstated. For a young girl whose identity was wrapped in movement, the sudden stillness was a form of grief. Yet, it was during this long, painful recovery that Doris found a different kind of rhythm. To pass the time, she began singing along to the radio, discovering a vocal purity that even she hadn't realized she possessed. She began taking lessons, and soon, the dancer became a singer. But this transition was born of necessity rather than a hunger for fame. Doris, at her core, remained a person who valued the domestic over the dramatic. She longed for a home, a husband, and the quiet safety of a conventional life. As she began to find work with big bands, her voice, warm, clear, and seemingly effortless, caught the attention of the nation. She was rebranded as Doris Day, a name she initially disliked because it felt like a stage persona she didn't quite own. This was the first of many masks. She was stepping into a world that saw her as a product, while internally, she was still the young girl looking for the security she felt she had lost in that car accident. She was resilient, yes, but that resilience made her vulnerable to those who promised to take care of her so she wouldn't have to fight alone. Doris found her voice and a path to the stars, but she also found her first taste of a darkness that would follow her into the bright lights of Hollywood. Who was the man who first dimmed her glow? By the time Doris Day became a household name with the hit, Sentimental Journey, she was already navigating a personal life that stood in stark contrast to the upbeat lyrics she sang. At 17, she married Al Jordan, a trombonist she had met on the circuit. What began as a youthful romance quickly descended into a psychological and physical nightmare. Jordan was a man consumed by jealousy and a violent temper. For Doris, the sentimental journey was a walk through a minefield. Psychologically, this period established a dangerous pattern. Doris was learning how to perform through pain. She would step onto a stage or into a recording booth, radiating the girl next door charm that the public craved, only to return to a home defined by volatility. This fragmentation of identity is a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a teenager in the national spotlight. She gave birth to her son, Terry, under the weight of this stress, eventually finding the courage to leave Jordan. But the damage was done. She had learned that the world's perception of her happiness had nothing to do with her actual reality. Her second marriage to George Weidler was brief and less violent, but it reinforced her sense of failure in achieving the one thing she actually wanted, a stable home. As her film career began to take off with Romance on the High Seas, the studio system began to mold her into an icon of wholesome American virtue. She was the woman men wanted to marry and women wanted as a friend. The industry demanded she be a beacon of light, leaving no room for the shadows of her past. She became a master of the closed-door policy, keeping her struggles tightly under wraps to protect the brand that was now feeding her family. Just as she thought she had finally found a partner who would protect her interests and provide the stability she craved, a new shadow emerged, one that would stay by her side for 17 years. In 1951, Doris Day married Marty Melcher. To the outside world, Marty was the answer to Doris's prayers. He was her husband, her agent, and eventually her producer. He took over every aspect of her professional life, allowing Doris to focus on what she did best, performing. For a woman who had been through the ringer of early stardom and abusive relationships, this surrender felt like a relief. She believed she had finally found the protector who would allow her to live the quiet life she wanted between takes. However, the psychological reality was far more complex. Melcher wasn't just managing her career, he was colonizing it. He became the gatekeeper of her time, her finances, and her relationships. Under the guise of protection, he isolated her. Doris, perhaps weary of making decisions that led to heartbreak, leaned into this dependency. It is a common human response to trauma to seek a strong figure to take the reins, but in doing so, Doris inadvertently became a passenger in her own life. Melcher was the architect of the Doris Day image, pushing her into roles that maintained her virginal, sunny persona long after she had outgrown them creatively. As the years passed, the gap between the woman and the image grew into a canyon. Doris was working grueling hours on film sets and recording studios, often to the point of exhaustion. She trusted Melcher implicitly when he told her they were building a massive nest egg for their future. She didn't check the bank accounts or read the fine print of the contracts he put in front of her. She signed where he pointed, believing that her loyalty was being rewarded with security. In reality, she was the engine of a machine that she didn't realize was running on empty. While Marty was building his empire on her talent, he was hiding a financial secret that would eventually bring her entire world crashing down. The 1950s and early 60s represented the zenith of Doris Day's power. She was the #1 box office star, a Grammy-nominated singer, and a cultural touchstone. Yet, this peak was also a period of profound psychological confinement. The "Eternal Virgin" label, famously joked about by her contemporaries, became a source of internal frustration. Doris was a grown woman, a mother, and someone who had seen the darker sides of life, yet she was trapped playing characters that never seemed to face real-world consequences. The silence in her life was twofold. There was the silence of her own voice in business matters, and the silence she maintained regarding her growing exhaustion. Melcher continued to book her for project after project, fearing that any gap in her schedule would diminish her value. This relentless pace took a toll on her health. She suffered from panic attacks and bouts of heart palpitations, often having to be treated on set. Yet, the show went on. The smile remained fixed, the hair remained perfectly coiffed, and the public never suspected that their "sunny day" was operating in a state of near-constant burnout. This chapter of her life is a study in the cost of the mask. To maintain the illusion of the perfect American woman, Doris had to suppress her own needs, her own fatigue, and her own suspicions. She lived in a bubble created by Melcher, seeing only the people he allowed and doing only the work he approved. The psychological isolation was nearly complete. She had traded her autonomy for the promise of a peaceful retirement that seemed to be perpetually just a few years away. She was the most successful woman in Hollywood, but she was effectively an employee of her own marriage. As the 1960s came to a close, a sudden tragedy would force Doris to look into the bank accounts she hadn't checked in nearly 2 decades. In April 1968, Marty Melcher died suddenly of heart disease. Doris was 46 years old, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she was the one who had to answer the door and open the mail. The grief was real, but it was quickly eclipsed by a revelation so profound it felt like a second car accident. As she began to settle Marty's estate with the help of her son, Terry, she discovered that the nest egg didn't exist. In fact, she wasn't just broke, she was $20 million in debt. The psychological betrayal was staggering. Marty Melcher, along with a lawyer named Jerome Rosenthal, had systematically embezzled her earnings, invested in failing oil wells, and committed her to various hotel schemes that had collapsed. Every sentimental journey, every Sarah, every hour spent under hot studio lights had been monetized and then vanished. Doris realized that the man she had shared her bed with for 17 years had been a stranger to her. He hadn't been her protector, he had been her predator. The fallout was more than financial. It was an identity crisis. Doris had to reconcile the fact that her entire life had been a series of deceptions. She had lived a double life, without even knowing it, one life as a beloved superstar, and another as a victim of a massive financial fraud. The legal battles that followed would last for years, dragging her through the very public eye she was desperate to escape. She was forced to confront her own naivety and the fact that her desire for a protector had left her completely defenseless. Among the hidden debts was a contract for a television show she had never agreed to do, and if she didn't show up, she would lose the little she had left. Doris Day hated the idea of television. She viewed it as a step down from the prestige of film and a grueling commitment she didn't want. However, she discovered that Marty had signed a contract for a series and several specials without her knowledge. If she refused to do the Doris Day show, the financial penalties would be the final blow to her already decimated estate. With no other choice, the woman who wanted to retire was forced back into the spotlight. This period of her life is perhaps her most impressive display of professional grit. She showed up to the set every day, grieving her husband and reeling from his betrayal, yet she delivered the same charm that had made her a star. The show ran for 5 seasons, and Doris involved herself in every detail, finally taking the reins of her own career. She was no longer the passive passenger. This was a psychological turning point. By being forced into the work she dreaded, she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She became her own manager, her own advocate, and her own protector. The unwilling icon became a symbol of survival. She fought Jerome Rosenthal in court for years, eventually winning a record-breaking $22 million judgment, though she would only collect a fraction of it. This era was about reclaiming her agency. She proved that the girl next door wasn't just a soft, sunshiny figure, she was a woman of steel. She used the very medium she feared to pay off her debts and secure her freedom. She was finally earning her own life, and in doing so, the mask of the innocent began to fall away, replaced by the face of a survivor. With her debts finally being settled, Doris made a choice that stunned Hollywood. Would she stay and fight for her throne, or disappear entirely? By the mid-1970s, Doris Day had done the impossible. She had paid off her debts, won her legal battles, and fulfilled her contracts. At an age where many stars were desperately clinging to their relevance, Doris did something radical. She walked away. She left Los Angeles and moved to Carmel by the Sea, a quiet, misty town on the California coast. She didn't announce a retirement, she simply stopped showing up to the game. This was the beginning of her true life. In Carmel, she turned her attention to her greatest passion, the welfare of animals. She founded the Doris Day Animal Foundation and became a tireless advocate for those who couldn't speak for themselves. Psychologically, this transition was a form of deep healing. Animals offered the unconditional love and honesty that had been so conspicuously absent from her professional and romantic life. In the company of dogs and cats, she didn't have to be Doris Day. She could just be Doris. Her great escape was a rejection of the Hollywood machine that had used her for decades. She stayed away from the red carpets and the award shows, preferring the company of her pets and a few close friends. She lived a life of routine and purpose, finally achieving the domestic peace she had sought since she was a teenager in Cincinnati. The double life was finally over because she had stopped trying to be two people. She was no longer a persona and a victim, she was a woman who had chosen her own sanctuary. Even in her quietest years, a final revelation about her true age and her private thoughts would surface, proving that Doris Day still had one last story to tell. In her later years, Doris Day became a legend of a different kind, the star who disappeared and found happiness in the silence. She occasionally gave phone interviews, her voice still sounding remarkably like the girl who sang Secret Love, but she rarely appeared in public. When she celebrated her 90th birthday, it was discovered that she was actually 92, even her age had been a studio-managed secret. She laughed it off, a final nod to the absurdity of the industry she had left behind. Doris Day passed away in 2019 at the age of 97. Her legacy is often simplified into a collection of movies and songs, but the true story is one of profound psychological resilience. She was a woman who was broken by fate, exploited by those she loved, and boxed in by an image she didn't choose. Yet, she emerged from the shadows of a double life to find a singular, authentic existence. She proved that it is never too late to take back your name and your life. As we reflect on her journey, we see that the sunshine wasn't a lie, it was a choice. Doris Day chose to remain kind despite the cruelty she faced. She chose to be hopeful despite the betrayals. Her life reminds us that behind every perfect image is a human heart fighting a battle we know nothing about. She didn't just survive Hollywood, she outlived its expectations of her. In the end, Doris Day wasn't the girl next door, she was the woman who finally found her way home. Does the world deserve to know the private pain of the people who give us so much joy, or is the greatest act of a star the ability to keep their own light burning, even in the dark? Perhaps the greatest secret Doris Day ever kept was that she was always stronger than the world gave her credit for.